The tea kettle should have whistled by now. Clara Monroe sat at the breakfast nook of her sunlit kitchen, the corners of her linen napkin folded with practiced precision, her back upright despite the weight of 76 winters pressing gently on her spine. Outside the frosted window panes, early autumn had begun painting the hills of Maple Hollow in hues of gold and rust. Her garden modest, yet meticulously kept swayed under the rhythm of a crisp breeze, as though the dahlias and coneflowers were rehearsing a ballet only they could hear. Clara couldn't hear it. Not the rustle of the trees, not the warble of the finches, not the shrill whistle of the kettle, which was now visibly steaming. She rose slowly, her house slippers whispering across the tile floor, and moved to lift the kettle before the sound even registered. A faint, faraway squeal finally reached her ears, dull and delayed, like hearing an echo in someone else's memory. "Strange," she murmured, setting the kettle down and reaching up to touch her left earlobe, as if the soft skin there could explain the sudden silence. Must be the old kettle. But even as she said it, her voice felt distant, muffled, like it was trapped behind glass. She poured the hot water over the loose-leaf chamomile and watched the yellow petals swirl inside the ceramic mug. Steam curled upward in elegant ribbons. Clara closed her eyes and imagined it as music, like the soft entrance of strings in the second movement of a symphony. Silence followed. Later that morning, she moved through her house like a conductor without an orchestra, each step deliberate, each movement precise. Her home reflected her in that way, tidy, classical, a little faded, but elegant still. Crystal figurines lined the mantel above the fireplace, gifts from students across 5 decades. A framed photo hung in the hallway, Clara, beaming beside a grand piano, surrounded by children mid-chorus, mouths open wide, joy spilling into the air like perfume. She touched the frame. That was the year we did The Sound of Music. Her voice echoed slightly in the quiet hall, as though the house hadn't heard it in a while. The phone rang. Or maybe it didn't. She wasn't sure. Clara noticed the blinking red light on her answering machine only by chance. As she passed through the sitting room with a folded afghan in hand, one new message. She pressed the button. A garbled voice, her neighbor June, crackled through. "Clara, I knocked earlier, but you must have been out in the yard. Anyway, garden club is meeting at 3. Hope you're still bringing that lemon loaf?" Clara stared at the machine. She hadn't heard the knock, hadn't heard the phone. June's house was just across the street, surely. She would have noticed her, but no. Clara had been pruning the rosemary, humming Clair de Lune in her head, lost in a melody she hadn't played in months, a melody she now feared she couldn't recreate. That night, Clara sat at her upright piano. The room was still. The keys, polished and ivory white, looked up at her like old friends waiting for conversation. Her fingers, thin but nimble, hovered above middle C. She struck the note. Nothing. No, there was sound, but it was off, muffled, flat, as though someone had placed a pillow over the strings. She tried again, and again. Her hands moved instinctively through the opening bars of Debussy, but the music came back to her like a stranger's whisper in the dark. She stopped, hands trembling slightly, and placed them gently in her lap, for the first time in a long time. Clara Monroe felt something she rarely allowed herself. Fear. If I can't hear the music, what's left of me? The wind picked up outside, rustling the brittle leaves, tossing them against the porch in dry swirls. But inside, Clara didn't hear them. Not really. She sat in stillness, the house now a shell that once echoed with arpeggios and adolescent voices, a silence had begun creeping in, soft, patient, and utterly complete. And she didn't know it yet, but it wasn't just her hearing that was fading. It was the life she had so carefully composed, note by note, year after year, and soon the time would come to decide whether she'd let it go or rewrite the score entirely. The audiologist's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon-scented floor polish clinical, cold, and a little too bright for Clara's liking. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, perched delicately at the edge of the gray upholstered chair, like a schoolgirl awaiting a report card she knew wouldn't be good. Across from her, a tall man in a blue lab coat skimmed her intake form, tapping the end of his pen against the clipboard with rhythmic impatience. Dr. Ethan Graham. It said on the nameplate perched beside a glass jar of tongue depressors. You were a music teacher, he asked without looking up. Already checking boxes on a form? For over 40 years, Clara replied softly. He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. And you first noticed the hearing trouble when... Clara hesitated. A few months ago, but it's gotten worse lately. I missed my tea kettle, my neighbor knocking, the phone. Ethan finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, but distracted. Right. We'll do a full audiogram and tympanometry. Shouldn't take long. The words fell around her like gravel, clinical, stripped of empathy. Clara gave a polite nod, the kind that masked her unease. In the classroom, she'd always prided herself on making her students feel seen. Here, she felt more like a malfunctioning instrument being evaluated for the junk bin. The tests were quick, efficient. Clara sat in a small soundproof booth, headphones pressed tightly over her ears. The world shrank inside. It was a coffin of silence, pierced only by faint tones, beeps that danced just beyond her reach. She strained to hear them, eyes narrowing in concentration, fingers twitching over the response button. Sometimes, she thought she heard one, but she wasn't sure. Other times, nothing. Just the dull rush of her own heartbeat and the breath she held like it might help her listen harder. When it was over, she stepped out into the too white light of the exam room, her hands feeling colder than when she'd entered. Ethan stared at the graph on the screen, lines dipping where they shouldn't. He scratched his jaw, then clicked his pen shut with a sigh. Well, he swiveled toward her, you have moderate to severe sensorineural hearing loss. It's progressive, likely age-related. Although you may have some long-term damage from high-frequency exposure, something not uncommon for music instructors. Clara blinked. Sensorineural. The word echoed inside her like a drum roll. It means the hair cells in your inner ear are damaged, Ethan said. There's no reversing it, but hearing aids will help you manage. I'd recommend starting soon. Clara stared at the screen, at the jagged graph that looked like a mountain range slowly collapsing. Manage, she repeated. The word as tasteless as chalk. He handed her a glossy brochure titled Living Well with Hearing Loss. On the cover, a gray-haired couple laughed in a garden, both of them far too cheerful to have just received this kind of news. I know it's a lot to take in, Ethan said, already rising from his seat. If you need time to adjust, we can schedule a fitting in a few weeks. She took the brochure, her fingers trembling slightly. Do you hear music? She asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. That made him pause. I suppose sometimes in the car. Clara's lips twitched into a half smile. Then you don't understand. She left the clinic with the brochure tucked into her handbag like a shameful secret. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the parking lot. Cars glinted like beetles. Somewhere, a lawnmower droned. She couldn't hear it clearly. She slid into her old Lincoln sedan and sat for a long moment, hands on the wheel, listening to the quiet hum of her own breath. That evening, Clara stood in her living room surrounded by silence. The grand piano sat untouched, its lacquered surface gleaming in the soft glow of the table lamp. She reached out and ran her fingers along the edge smooth. Familiar? Her reflection shimmered on the black surface, ghostly and fractured. She sat, lifted the fallboard, and placed her hands on the keys. Gently, she played the opening chords to Moon River. The notes came, but they felt like they came from somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. The melody sounded like it was being played underwater. Tears welled in her eyes, not out of sorrow, but confusion, disorientation, loss. It was like looking at a painting she'd created, only to realize the colors had faded and the frame was cracked. Clara Monroe had spent her life helping others hear the music within themselves. Now, in the stillness of her home, she wasn't sure she could hear her own. Clara Monroe had always believed that silence was a tool. In her music room, it was sacred, the pause between notes that heightened anticipation, the space where emotion gathered its breath before rising again. Silence, when chosen, was power. But this was different. This silence had not been chosen, and it did not wait politely between phrases. It crept in uninvited, settled into corners, and coiled itself around once familiar sounds like ivy choking a trellis. It was heavy, suffocating, and it followed her everywhere. The days blurred. Clara no longer turned on the radio in the mornings. She couldn't bear the tinny, distorted voices or melodies that arrived garbled, like old cassette tapes stretched too far. Her once beloved station, the classical channel that opened each hour with a cheerful chime, and the weather in Concord now sounded like static, laced with ghosts. Even birdsong had lost its brilliance. The robins outside her kitchen window opened their beaks and offered their morning greetings. But to Clara, they were pantomimes, beaks moving without substance, wings fluttering in soundless beats. She missed them. She missed everything. When the local community orchestra mailed out its fall season schedule, a postcard with golden violins and crisp lettering, Clara didn't pin it to the corkboard like she usually did. She slid it into a drawer, beneath old receipts and grocery lists, like an invitation to a party she no longer belonged to. The invitation felt cruel. On Tuesday, she walked into the Willow Bay Cafe, where she used to meet friends after church. She greeted the hostess with a smile, but the reply came muffled. Clara leaned in, frowned, and nodded vaguely. She wasn't sure what had been said. A greeting, a question, a comment on the weather. She sat in the corner booth and ordered her usual a slice of lemon pie and a cup of Earl Grey. She could see the waitress's lips form the words, "Warm it up for you, Miss Monroe," but the words themselves floated away like mist. Clara nodded again, tired of pretending. When the pie arrived, she stared at it for a long time before lifting her fork. In the background, a soft jazz tune played saxophone and piano, barely audible to the average ear. Clara couldn't tell if it was real or if she was remembering it. She heard it in her head, clear as day, but the air around her remained vacant. The phone rarely rang anymore, and when it did, Clara often let it go to voicemail. She had grown tired of saying what and could you repeat that and pretending she understood the replies. One day, her old student, Melody Chen, now a cellist with the Boston Symphony, left a long, sweet message inviting Clara to a special alumni performance. "We're dedicating it to you," Melody said. "You changed our lives, Miss Monroe." Clara sat by the phone long after the message ended. The words crumpled in her chest like a discarded handkerchief. She hadn't even heard the cello in the background of the call, only Melody's voice, distant and mechanical. She didn't call back. One evening, as dusk painted long shadows across her parlor, Clara sat on the piano bench in silence. Not to play. She had stopped doing that days ago, but simply to sit. Her hands lay in her lap. The fallboard was closed. A fine layer of dust had begun to gather across the keys. She thought about how her mother had once said that when the heart breaks, it doesn't shatter, it folds. And Clara felt folded, pressed neatly by invisible hands, like an old letter no one reads anymore. At church, the hymns felt like dreams she could no longer touch. People sang, mouths open in joyful praise, and Clara mimicked the motions not out of faith, but habit. Her voice, once a soaring mezzo-soprano that led the alto section with grace, now faltered and faded. She couldn't tell if she was on key, couldn't tell if she was even singing. After service, she walked out without speaking to anyone. The world around her had become a blur of smiles and nods, conversations happening just beyond the reach of comprehension. She felt like she was watching her own life through a window, a pane of glass thick with distance. And yet, the cruelest loss was not the absence of sound. It was the disconnection. The music hadn't only lived in her ears, it had lived in her relationships, her confidence, her sense of meaning, now. Even in the presence of others, she felt herself withdrawing, shrinking like a shoreline, swallowed by tide. She stopped attending the garden club, skipped the community potluck. When neighbors waved from their porches, she smiled faintly and retreated indoors, letting the door close with a soft click behind her. One night, unable to sleep, Clara opened the bench of her piano and pulled out a worn manila folder. Inside were handwritten lesson plans, faded recital programs, and thank you notes from students now scattered across the country. One note, written in pink crayon on wide-line paper, read, "Miss Monroe, you taught me more than music. You taught me to believe in myself. Lila, age 9. Clara pressed the note to her chest and let the silence fill the room. It was not a peaceful silence. Not yet. The evening was dressed in velvet. It was the first Friday of November, and the town's old concert hall had come alive with coats, perfume, and the quiet clamor of anticipation. The annual Maple Hollow Fall Gala was a cherished tradition, part fundraiser, part celebration, and this year, the Community Youth Orchestra was performing a medley of film scores under soft golden lights and chandeliers that trembled when the bass drum hit just right. Clara hadn't intended to go. She had stared at the invitation card on her kitchen counter for over a week, cream-colored cardstock, gold foil lettering, her name handwritten in the corner with care. It was from Jeremy Reed, her former student and now the conductor of the youth orchestra. He'd written, "We'd be honored if you joined us. Miss Monroe, we're playing one of your old arrangements." That part broke her heart. But something inside her, perhaps guilt, perhaps nostalgia, or maybe just muscle memory from years of civic duty compelled her to press her hair, pull on her wool coat, and take the slow walk to the concert hall. The ushers welcomed her like royalty. "Miss Monroe, you're here, row 5, just for you." She smiled, lips tight, and nodded. She didn't mention that the man's voice sounded warped, like it had passed through a tin can. Instead, she gripped the handrail and descended toward her seat, one slow step at a time. The crowd buzzed with excitement. People chatted, laughed, leaned over programs. Clara heard none of it clearly, just fragments, hollow syllables, the clink of jewelry, the rustle of fabric. Her hearing aid knew, expensive, and supposedly top of the line offered only distortion, like a bad translation of a language she once knew fluently. When the lights dimmed and the conductor lifted his baton, Clara sat up straight. The curtain rose. The first violins began the shimmering swell of Moonlight Serenade, her own arrangement from 20 years ago. But something was wrong. The notes didn't lift her. They didn't wrap around her ribs like they used to. The music, her music, was garbled broken, fractured into high-pitched whistles and low, soupy thuds. The instruments collided in her ears instead of blending. Harmonies that should have soared now clashed and buckled like a building mid-collapse. Her breathing quickened. She adjusted her hearing aid. Then again, she turned it off, then back on. Nothing helped. The music wasn't music. It was noise. She looked around, people smiling, heads swaying gently, hands tapping. She was the only one sinking. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember how it had sounded the night her students first played it. The memory refused to come. Her hands gripped the program in her lap, crumpling its edges. And then the tears began, not dainty drops, but a sudden rush, like a dam breaching. She stood abruptly, nearly knocking her purse to the floor. The woman beside her flinched. Startled, Clara whispered, "Excuse me," but she couldn't hear her own voice and wasn't sure if she'd spoken at all. She stumbled down the aisle, eyes stinging, chest tight. The exit sign glowed red and distant. The music followed her like a taunt. Outside, the night air hit her like a wave. Cold, sharp, real. Clara leaned against the railing outside the concert hall, breath heaving in tight sobs. The street lamps painted yellow halos on the sidewalk. A few latecomers passed by and glanced at her, but no one stopped. Who would? She was just an old woman crying outside a concert she couldn't hear. "You okay?" The voice was soft and clear. Clara turned. A young woman stood nearby, maybe in her 20s, with a canvas bag slung over one shoulder and short cropped hair that curled slightly at the edges. Her fingers moved quickly, signing something. Clara blinked. Sorry, I don't know sign language," she said, her voice shaking. The girl smiled and repeated the motion, slower this time, pointing to herself. Then she mouthed, "Becca." Clara nodded. "Clara." Becca gestured toward the building behind them, raising her brows as if to ask, "Bad concert." Clara laughed, a short, watery sound. "I couldn't hear it," she said. "Not the way I used to. It was mine. You know, that arrangement. I wrote it years ago." Becca tilted her head with curiosity. "I used to teach music," Clara added, her throat tightening. "Now I can't even recognize a C major from a train horn." Becca reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. She scribbled something and turned it toward Clara. "You don't need ears to feel music." Clara stared at the sentence. It sat there on the page like a door waiting to be opened. Another line followed. "We do signed choir at the center on Wednesdays. Want to come?" Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "Maybe." Becca smiled, gave a small wave, and walked off into the night, her footsteps soft on the concrete. Clara stood there a long while, the wind whispering through the trees. She could barely hear it, but she could feel it, the shift in the air, the stirring of possibility. Something had broken tonight. But in the ruins, a new rhythm had begun. Wednesday came cloaked in overcast skies and a sleepy drizzle. The kind of day Clara once would have filled with piano etudes, tea, and phone calls to former students. But now, it was simply quiet, the kind that sat heavily on your shoulders like a wool coat gone damp. She stood in front of the Maple Hollow Community Center, gripping the strap of her handbag with both hands. The building was unremarkable red brick, flat roof, windows lined with white painted metal, A banner near the door read, "Sign Choir, Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Everyone welcome." The letters were cheerful, but her stomach twisted with doubt. "I'm too old for this," she whispered to herself. But something, perhaps the memory of Becca's calm eyes, or that bold black ink on the page, "You don't need ears to feel music," pushed her forward. Inside, the building buzzed with life. Children darted past in colorful sneakers. An older man wheeled a cart of juice boxes down the hall. The walls were plastered with finger paintings and flyers for yoga, book clubs, beginner computer classes. A warmth filled the place that reminded Clara of old-school hallways just without the bells and clamor. She followed the faint sound of feet shuffling and hands clapping down the corridor until she reached room 12. There, behind the half-open door, was something Clara had never seen before. A silent symphony. About a dozen people, young, old, in wheelchairs, with walkers, wearing hoodies or floral scarves, stood in a semicircle, eyes locked on the woman at the front, Becca. She was signing a rhythm, her hands flowing like water, crisp, precise, almost like dancing. Her fingers fluttered, paused, then swept outward. The group responded in unison, their arms and bodies moving with silent coordination. There were no instruments, no melody, no audible cues. And yet, there was music. Clara stood in the doorway, stunned, her eyes welled. Becca spotted her and beamed. She gestured warmly, motioning Clara to come in. Clara stepped inside slowly, trying to blend in, though she felt like a ghost among fireflies. "Everyone," Becca signed and spoke softly. "This is Clara. She used to teach music." A few in the group signed welcome, a sweeping motion across the chest. Clara gave a shy smile, heart thudding in her ears. The next hour unfolded like magic. Becca introduced Clara to the concept of sign singing, a performance art where American Sign Language ASL is used to express lyrics through motion, facial expression, and rhythm. The body becomes the instrument. The eyes replace the ears. They began with "Lean on Me." Clara watched, hands at her sides, as the group translated the song when they reached the chorus. Even the elderly gentleman with the walker, Mr. Patel, she learned later, signed with a quiet power, his fingers slightly shaky but filled with meaning. Becca approached Clara with an encouraging look, slowly, gently. She guided Clara's hands into position, finger by finger, motion by motion. Clara's first attempts were clumsy. Her gestures were stiff, and she forgot which hand came first. But Becca only smiled and nodded, mouthing the words, "You're doing fine." And then something shifted. Halfway through the second verse, Clara stopped trying to get it right. She closed her eyes, felt the rhythm not through her ears, but through the beat of her chest, the weight of her hands, the emotion swelling in the room like a tide. She felt the song. She became it. When the song ended, Clara looked around the room. No one applauded, but everyone signed, clapping fingers waving in the air like leaves trembling in wind. The kind of applause that didn't hurt your ears, but hit you in the heart. Clara signed it back, her smile trembling. Over the next few weeks, she became a regular. She bought an ASL dictionary, practiced finger spelling while boiling pasta, labeled items in her kitchen with little signs. She learned how to say music. Joy, remember, thank you. Her hands, once limited to piano keys, now danced freely in air. And she wasn't alone. She bonded with Inez, a retired seamstress who lost her hearing after a stroke. They traded stories through scribbled notes and laughter. She laughed with Zeke, a 14-year-old with cochlear implants who used hip-hop rhythms to inspire hand gestures. She even shared coffee with Becca, who revealed she was raised by deaf parents and had grown up straddling two worlds, one of sound, one of silence. "I used to wish I could sing," Becca told her once. "Now I know I always could, just differently." Clara's eyes had filled at that. "I used to think I'd lost music forever." She'd replied, "Turns out, I'd only misplaced it." One evening, Clara stayed late after rehearsal. Alone in room 12, she stood in front of the mirror mounted on the wall. She lifted her hands and signed the first few lines of "You Are My Sunshine." Her reflection stared back older. Yes, wiser, softer, and whole. For the first time in months, she didn't feel broken. She didn't feel old or discarded or silent. She felt heard. The snow came early that December. By the end of the first week, Maple Hollow had transformed into a postcard rooftops frosted in white, lamplight glowing amber through flurries, and footsteps muffled beneath thick powder. Children dragged sleds through the park. Neighbors hung garlands along their porches. The entire town seemed to exhale into winter. Inside her small bungalow, Clara Monroe stood at her piano not to play, but to sort. She'd taken everything out of the bench: folders, sheet music, student compositions, programs dating back to the mid-'80s, a piece of notebook paper from a child named Javier that read, "In crooked handwriting, you make music feel like magic." Clara sat cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by these paper echoes of her life. For the first time since her hearing had declined, she didn't feel pain looking at them. She felt ready. That afternoon, she placed the old music back into the bench, not as relics, but as roots, and then she packed a bag. Inside went a blank notepad, her new ASL songbook, and a scarf knit by Inez. She was going to the community center, not as a student this time, as a teacher. The first class was small, just 4 participants: a timid young boy named Theo who barely looked up from his shoes, a woman in her 40s named Marisol with recent, sudden hearing loss, Mr. Patel, whose tremors made signing difficult but not impossible, and Zeke, full of teenage swagger and too cool to care charm. Though Clara knew better. They gathered in room 12, under a sign taped to the door, "Expressive Rhythm, Feel the Beat Without a Sound," led by Clara Monroe. Becca had designed it, bright colors and all. She gave Clara a quick hug before the class started, then stood off to the side in quiet support. Clara walked to the front of the room and took a slow breath. She began with a story. "I used to think music was something you hear." She signed and spoke at the same time, carefully, "but now I know it's something you feel, in your bones, in your chest, in your hands." She tapped her heart gently. "We're going to make music today, not with our voices, but with our stories, our movement, our joy." They began with simple claps, not timed to a metronome, but to breath, to heartbeat. Clara had them close their eyes, touch their chests, and find their own rhythm. Then she moved into tapping exercises: knees, palms, feet on the floor. They created a shared rhythm together, felt through the floorboards and across the circle. Zeke, predictably, rolled his eyes until she challenged him to lead. He rose like a spark. His rhythm was fast, sharp, syncopated, and alive. Clara watched as Theo began mirroring him, clapping small and shy at first, then faster. Mr. Patel chuckled aloud when he accidentally tapped off beat, but Clara signed perfect with a wink. By the end of the class, they were laughing, moving, feeling. Over the next few weeks, more joined. A woman named Judith, newly retired, with deep laugh lines and a dancer's poise. Two teenagers who had never sung in public, but signed lyrics like poetry. A Vietnam veteran with a cochlear implant and a jazz drummer's soul. Clara brought in scarves, ribbons, drum pads, metronomes with visual pulses. The class grew, not just in size, but in spirit. Word spread. People didn't call it the deaf class or the music therapy group. They called it Clara's rhythm room. One day, Clara arrived early. She opened the blinds and let the winter light flood in. Her hearing aid was off, the world was silent, still, peaceful. She walked to the mirror and signed a line from Amazing Grace. I once was lost, but now am found. Behind her, Becca appeared in the doorway, a paper in her hand. Jeremy wants to know, she said gently, if you'll conduct the youth orchestra's spring piece with the signed choir, a joint performance. He says it was your idea years ago, but they never had someone who could lead both. Clara turned, her eyes shimmered. I don't conduct anymore, she whispered, before a smile crept in, but I can show them how to listen. Becca smiled, folded her arms. So that's a yes. Clara nodded. It's a beginning. Later that evening, Clara sat on her porch, wrapped in a thick shawl, watching the snow fall like quiet applause from the heavens. She couldn't hear it, but she didn't need to. She felt the weight of it in the air, the hush between flakes, the pulse of her own chest, the flickering warmth of her students learning to speak without sound. For years, she had taught music. Now, she was teaching underneath it. And in that space, the one beyond the notes, beyond the loss, Clara found the one gift no silence could take. The power to help others feel whole again. The Maple Hollow Spring Arts Festival hadn't changed much over the years. The same creaky stage stood at the center of the town green, adorned with climbing ivy and bunting that fluttered in the April breeze. Fold-out chairs lined the grass like dutiful rows of sunflowers, and paper lanterns swayed from the bare branch trees that were just starting to bud. But this year, something was different. At the heart of the program, between the elementary school's folk dance and the senior choir's rendition of God Bless America, sat an act no one had seen before. The Maple Hollow Youth Orchestra and signed choir, a new harmony, conducted by Clara Monroe. The name printed on the program sent ripples through the crowd long before the performance began. Clara hadn't stood on a stage in over a decade. The whispers buzzed like bees. She's back. I thought she stopped teaching. She can't hear anymore. Right. She's always been the best. Behind the stage, Clara stood in the shade of a magnolia tree, her hands clasped in front of her, watching her students warm up. It was a hybrid crew, young violinists, a few high school percussionists, and a line of expressive signers ranging in age from 9 to 79. Zeke stood near the timpani, twirling his sticks like a showman. Inez was fussing with her scarf, while Judith helped Theo tuck in his shirt. Marisol adjusted her hearing aid and gave Clara a nervous smile. They had practiced this for months, weeks of syncing gestures with a sound, of aligning the meaning of lyrics with the emotion of movement. Clara had worked with Jeremy, the orchestra conductor, to find ways to cue changes visually instead of musically. She had written out full gesture maps. She had memorized every beat. Now it was time. Becca stepped beside her, clipboard in hand. You okay? Clara nodded slowly. I think I'm more nervous than they are. Becca signed breathe, slow and exaggerated. Clara chuckled. Jeremy waved from the stage entrance. You're up. As Clara stepped onto the stage, the audience hushed. She wore a soft navy blue dress, a silk scarf at her neck, and a pin in the shape of a treble clef over her heart. Her white hair was swept into a low bun, elegant, steady. She turned to face the orchestra and choir. Her baton, a sleek, polished length of birch, rested in her hand like it had never left. With a subtle movement, she raised it. Silence. Then a cue. The strings began, slow and deliberate, a minor progression that floated over the green like mist on a pond. The woodwinds followed, bright and cautious. Zeke tapped a gentle rhythm on the side of the drum. Then the signed choir began. No voices, just hands. They moved as one arcing, flowing, sweeping through the lyrics of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Their faces bore every note, joy, longing, hope, each word painted not with sound, but with soul. The audience watched in stillness. Clara didn't hear the music, but she felt it. She felt it in the synchronized sweep of arms, in the tremble of fingers during the bridge, in the precise downbeat of her baton, echoed in every gaze on stage. She had never conducted like this before, not with sound, but with trust, with connection. In the final crescendo, Theo stepped forward and signed the last line alone. Dreams really do come true. His eyes shone. His small hands moved like he believed every word. The orchestra ended on a sustained chord, rich and full. Clara held the final beat in the air for one long, breathless moment, then lowered her baton. Silence. And then waves of hands rose in the air, deaf applause, soft, fluttering fingers like leaves caught in a breeze. Others clapped, some stood, a few simply cried. Clara turned toward the audience and signed thank you a single gesture, slow and heartfelt. In the front row, a woman in a green cardigan leaned forward and whispered to her husband, "That was the most beautiful thing I've never heard." Afterward, children gathered around the stage, asking to learn the signs. Parents hugged their kids a little tighter. Jeremy found Clara backstage and grinned. "I think we just started a tradition." Clara looked around at her students, beaming, proud, alive. "Good," she said. "Let's keep the harmony going." That night, Clara returned home and stood by her piano. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She walked to her bookshelf and picked up the framed photo of her first classroom choir, the one where a 6-year-old Melody Chen was holding a tambourine upside down. She smiled. Music was no longer a sound trapped in keys or chords. It was a gesture, a glance, a heartbeat shared between people. And it was still hers. All of it. Spring melted into summer with the patience only small towns understand. Maple Hollow awoke in slow blooms. The air warmed. The lilacs opened, and Clara Monroe's garden began to breathe again. Daisies returned in quiet rows. Her rose bushes cut back harshly after the first frost stretched their limbs skyward. Forgiving her neglect with soft pink petals, Clara moved through her home like someone who'd finally unpacked a heavy grief. She didn't play the piano much anymore. Not because she couldn't, but because she no longer needed to cling to it. It sat near the front window, its keys still polished, still dignified, like an old friend who knew it was loved, even when left alone. Every morning, she brewed tea and stepped out onto the porch with her scarf, her notepad, and a small speaker that connected directly to her hearing aid through a low-frequency channel. From there, she listened to nature not with clarity, but with intention, not with ears, but with attention. The wind had a pulse. The bees moved like a string section. The soft whir of the sprinkler became percussion. Music hadn't returned to her in the way she once knew it. It had evolved, and so had she. One afternoon in July, Clara sat with Becca beneath the maple tree in the park, the one that gave the town its name. Children ran through sprinklers nearby. A food truck rolled by playing music Clara barely registered. She watched a young couple sit on a bench, laughing, holding hands, utterly unaware of how rich their moment was. Becca handed her a fresh printed flyer. Coming this fall, Expressive Arts for All Ages, new sessions with Clara Monroe. Clara laughed under her breath, her eyes crinkling. I'm becoming a brand, she said, raising an eyebrow. You're becoming a movement, Becca corrected. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't press in, the kind that felt full. That evening, Clara sat in her music room, bathed in golden light. She opened her drawer and pulled out a letter she'd written months ago, a letter to her younger self, the one she couldn't finish until now. She unfolded the paper and read it aloud, softly. Dear Clara, when the music stopped, I thought it was the end of me. I confused silence for failure. I mistook hearing loss for erasure. But I was wrong. The silence didn't mean there was nothing left. It meant something new was waiting beneath the surface, beneath the notes, beneath the identity I thought I had to keep forever. I used to teach people to sing. Now I teach them to speak without sound, to feel without hearing, to belong without explanation. And in doing so, I found myself again. Not the version who heard everything, but the one who finally learned how to listen. Yours, Clara. She folded the letter and placed it inside her music bench, alongside the others, no longer tucked away in grief, but resting in peace. Later that night, the sky darkened to velvet. Stars blinked quietly overhead, and the moon spilled light onto the edges of Clara's lawn. She sat on the porch swing with her shawl wrapped tight, breathing in the warm air, her eyes closed. The cicadas sang. The breeze hummed through the hedges. Her wind chimes swayed faint, like distant bells underwater. Clara didn't hear it clearly, but she didn't need to. She placed a hand over her heart and smiled. Because now, even in silence, she was surrounded by music,